The word of God is alive and powerful. It is sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, cutting between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow. It exposes our innermost thoughts and desires. This was my understanding when I was a Christian. This was, I suppose, part of my reason for leaving Christianity was the claim that I always understood that the Bible is the most deep, the most profound, the most powerful piece of writing possible. So my question is the Bible really that deep?
So I actually really resonate with this question, and I've wondered this on a regular basis. I do at times wonder, are we making too much of a word, the word in Greek or the word in Hebrew that is used? Are we making too much of a phrase? And a lot of this depends on your view of the Bible, right? So if whether or not, let's start with whether or not you think the Bible's true, start there. But then how is it true? That gets into like the idea of, is it true inerrantly? Which is, a lot of Christians would say every single word in Greek or Hebrew is handpicked by God. That's the way in which it's true. Or other camp would say infallible, which would be more of the ideas that are communicated are true, even though the words may not be, as handpicked by God. Here's what I would say. This is, let me be a human here for a second. I have a master's degree in biblical theology. If the answer to your question is that the Bible isn't as deep as we think, myself and many others have wasted a lot of time and a lot of money. So I acknowledge a bias I have even into this question because I'm pot committed to this, right? I have spent so many dollars, so much of my time studying this that it would be hard for me to come to the conclusion, yeah, it's actually not as deep as we thought. There's, that would be a tough thing. So I think I have to acknowledge my bias there. I want to believe that it's as deep as it is, right? Because I've given so much of my life to this. So I think that's a presupposition I bring to this conversation. I do remember a story when I was in Bible college, undergrad, and we were in a class and the professor had us break into groups. And I really have remembered this one particular day because I thought it was such an interesting assignment. And the assignment was, all right, your group has to figure out, you can only save 5 books of the Bible and all the other ones are going to be lost to history forever. Which 5 books do you save? And then give us like 10 minutes. And each group had to figure out, okay, you can only save 5. Which 5 do you save? And it was such an interesting conversation to like, it's like Survivor, Bible books, like which one's going to get voted off the island and why, and which ones are most important? What would we lose the most, and so that 10-minute conversation, whatever it was, made me realize or see the Bible uniquely, not just for like, oh, it's cool text, but like what do we actually need, from it? So then we get done with that. And then the professor says, okay, now you have to remove 2 off your list. You can only keep 3. Which 3 do you keep? You have 5 minutes. And then, same thing. And then it got down to 1. You can only keep 1 book of the Bible. Which one do you keep? Another 5 minutes. And again, just the conversations were so fascinating. And I'll never forget the professor said, okay, now imagine you could keep none. That we lose the Bible as we know it to history. What have we lost? And, start asking the question, would we still have Christianity? Would we still have belief in Jesus? Like what if you literally had none of that, what would you have? And it was such a great opportunity for me. And what I realized in that discussion is, and again, I got to say this well, because this is going to get clipped. I realized that I would still have my faith in Jesus. I would still be a Christian, even if the Bible didn't exist, even if we had none of it left. And so in that sense, we don't need the Bible because our faith is built on something beyond that. Now, with that in mind, I would say I'm incredibly grateful we have it. And I love that we're unpacking it a chapter at a time in a podcast like this because there's so much there. So I would say I do think the Bible is invaluable as a, you ask compared to other works of literature, as a a document compared to any other document the world has ever seen, right? I would say it's invaluable for two reasons. One, at least two reasons. One would be God stoops down to meet us where we are, and you have example after example after example. Every one of those examples points us to Jesus, shows us the nature of who God is in the person of Jesus. And so we have a chronicling throughout history of God stooping down over and over and over again to meet with God's people. And I think there's nothing else like it that gives us an account of how far God has been willing to go to meet with God's people and bring us along. Secondly, it gives us a unique account of how God has progressively revealed who God is and how we can make sense of so much of history in that light and in that context, with the big reveal being Jesus. And so I would say the Bible is uniquely able to help us better see Jesus. It is not another member of the Trinity. It is not something to be worshiped. It is not something to make an idol, but it does offer a unique resource that you're not going to find anywhere else. Now, here's my wild card back to you. Because you are acknowledging a very Christian understanding, a very, I would say, commonly Christian understanding of verse 12 is referring to the Bible. So here's my rebuttal to that. What if this verse isn't talking about the Bible? Now you might be going, whoa, Jeremy, hold on. Now, listeners, before you turn the podcast off or throw your listening device into your pool, just hold on. I want you to remember something. When Hebrews was written, there was no the Bible, right? Didn't exist. So what you and I know of as a Bible, if you are reading along Hebrews 4 with us right now and you have a Bible open, what you're looking at right now did not exist. They didn't have that. Not to mention, most people at this time were illiterate. So even if they would have had the Bible, they couldn't have read it, right? What if, this is just a crazy thought to throw out there, what if this section is actually talking about Jesus, like we constantly see throughout the book of Hebrews, that we think we're starting with something and then it's like, oh, we're actually going to get to Jesus. Now, let me take you on a little journey, Jeff, to see how you can get there if you want to get there with me. Hebrews 4, look at verses 12 through 14. Okay, so you read 12. Your question comes out of 12. For the word of God is alive and powerful. It is sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, cutting between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow. It exposes our innermost thoughts and desires, which easily could sound like it's talking about the Bible. But read in context, notice the shift in verse 13, the very next phrase. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God. Okay, so now the very next thought is we're not talking about God. Everything is naked and exposed before his eyes. So this is all contextualizing verse 12 in light of God, not in light of a book, right? And he is the one to whom we are accountable. So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, this is now verse 14, notice another shift. Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. So it shifts from verse 12 that kind of has language that would lead to sounding like we're talking about the Bible. And again, if you just read Hebrews 12 or Hebrews 4:12 without any of the other verses, which is normally how it's quoted, it does easily sound like the Bible. But if you remember, there was no the Bible. This isn't, we're reading back into that. And then you take the very next verse, which is 13, which shifts it to God. Then the very next verse, 14, shifts it to Jesus, right? Or not shifted, but I would say narrows it down even closer. Like, oh, what we're actually talking about is the person of Jesus. Like all of this. I think that actually is a better reading of verse 12. That it's not actually talking about the book that we tend to think it's talking about. This is, again, talking about Jesus in a unique way with some language that maybe is more artistic. Now you're saying, well, what? The Word of God is the Bible. Jeremy, everybody knows that. Christianity 101. Well, friends, I'm here to tell you, the Word of God is not the Bible. The Word of God is Jesus. We just saw that in Hebrews 4, verses 12 through 14. I made that argument. Let me show you another one that's real easy to see. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Bible? No. The Word was with God. The Bible? No. And the Word was God. The Bible? No. He existed in the beginning with God. This is Jesus. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The Word of God is Jesus. And I suspect the author of Hebrews would be potentially a little frustrated that we have only applied verse 12 to the book that we now know as the Bible, that the author of Hebrews would have no idea what we were talking about.
Well, so just curious, I was thinking about the beginning of John once you started to say that. And my understanding is the epistles were written before the Gospel of John. Is that your understanding? So would this be the first case of referring to Jesus as the Word, or do you think John precedes Hebrews?
Oh man, my Bible college professors would be mad at me right now. I don't remember all the orders. I think most of the letters were written first.
Well, if we're gonna go with Jesus, then all of my complaints about about problematic passages just go out the window. So that's too bad for me. But I'm sure we'll get to some of those again.
I'm nothing if not
another
consistent,
time,
Jeff. At least you got to acknowledge. I play this card over and over and over.
Yeah. You Jesus juked me once again. How do I keep falling for it? All right. Well, so here's a follow-up question. If the Word of God is Jesus, right? I like that. Jesus has very profound and potent words to share with us. Where do we find what Jesus has to say?
In the recorded form from the people who hung out with him and wrote down things that he said, things they heard. So that's where we would read about that.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I would suggest, and this is where you and I are similar, where we start, and then I think we take it different directions. I would agree with you. If the only Jesus I ever saw was Jesus that I can read about in the Bible, and I did not believe that there was any real Jesus that was alive today, or I had never had an experience with Jesus, I would conclude with you that, yeah, I don't think this is real. Where you and I think differ is I would say, yeah, I have had numerous profound experiences with Jesus. And so one way to find out about Jesus is through the written text, but another way is to just experience Jesus, like to have real moments. Now, again, the hard part of that is we leave any type of scientific talk there, right? Because I can't prove to you that these stories would be definitively Jesus. I can't measure them. We can measure the historicity of the text in the scriptures. We can talk about that. But if I'm telling you a personal story of mine, who's to say it's Jesus or it's my imagination, right? So that's where it gets very anecdotal. But that's for me personally why I would say, yeah, I have experienced Jesus in my own life, one-on-one. I have experienced Jesus through other people. And I have experienced Jesus through reading about what his original followers said about him. And so I think all of those are ways that you experience the Word of God. And if, I only had one of them, I wouldn't choose it to be the text. I would choose it to be my personal experience with Jesus today. But I'm grateful for all of those. And I think sadly, we relegate Jesus only to what is recorded in, these pages. And that's all Jesus can do. And I think we totally miss the concept of like, if Jesus is alive and if what they said about him is true, you should be able to experience Jesus today. And that is what, my faith is built on.
Yeah, and I mean, I like personal experience too, right? Like a big part of my story is seeking to hear directly from God or Jesus, and see what he has to say, what direction he has for my life, right? I'm open to it, right? And something I can't help but think about is the diversity of religious experience, and by that I mean everyone has their Jesus, right? Like some people say Jesus told me to vote Republican. And some people say, well, if you really knew Jesus, you would never vote Republican. Just to take one example, you can apply this to anything. It doesn't need to be politics. And there's just no way to confirm, which again, it makes sense if religion is just this personal journey within your own mind, and that gives life meaning. Again, I'm all for that. I wouldn't even want to take that away from people, but uh, how do we know it's Jesus if the same Jesus is telling different people different things?
That's a great question. It reminds me of a situation I would often find myself in when I was, in full-time ministry, where I would be meeting with someone and, we'd be talking through something they're working through in their life. And, they might at times tell me something and go, well, Jesus told me, da, da, da. And sometimes it would be absurd stuff. Like I remember one time someone just said, yeah, Jesus told me to divorce my wife because this other girl is clearly my soulmate and I'm like way more in love with her. And I remember, I don't know, I felt bold that day, but I was like, yeah, I don't think Jesus told you that. And he's like, no, I'm telling you, Jesus told me that. And I'm like, and I'm telling you, I don't think Jesus told you that. Like, that doesn't sound like Jesus. So I do think there's got to be some baseline, right? If Jesus can be anything to anyone, then Jesus becomes nothing, and it's almost like a Santa Claus figure of whatever fable you attach to him becomes part of the collective, myth. I would say, we go back to what do we find in the Gospels, and that becomes that's the initial benchmark that we see, and then we compare off of that. And so, if someone comes to me today and tells me that Jesus is telling them, to go and murder someone, I would confidently say I don't think that sounds like Jesus, because the Jesus that I've experienced and discovered didn't operate like that, and I think this is where we have to go back to. It does matter. Reading the text does matter. Having a healthy theology does matter. Having a healthy imagination about what do you picture when you picture God matters, right? And at the end of the day, it doesn't solve the problem you're saying, because you can still have someone say, well, my Jesus told me this. And, all I can do as a rebuttal is to say, that doesn't sound like Jesus to me. And they can't prove it is, and I can't prove it isn't. And that's part of the mystery of faith. But that mystery is there regardless, if you believe in something or not. Like we all can't prove, what these bigger questions. We ultimately have to say, this makes the most sense to me, and land where we land.
Yeah. It's a mystery either way. I agree with that, because if there is no God, then it's just up to us to kind of decide what moral values are, right? That's a common objection to atheism, is what moral standard do you have to base that on?
Yeah.
But I would say the dangerous side of religion is it gives people authority, right? Like that guy who wanted to divorce his wife, maybe in his head he had to convince himself Jesus told him to, and that's what allowed him to move forward with that. Or
You're absolutely right. And some of the worst parts of history have illustrated that. The Crusades, the Inquisition.
Yeah.
When Christians have, and even Hitler believed what he was doing was, authorized by God. And some of the very worst stuff that's ever been done has been done with someone thinking they've got God's backing behind it. So I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I think it matters, like, to go back and go, does it actually look like Jesus as we find in the Gospels? Does it actually look like, And I think the Gospels present a very beautifully profound, compelling person of Jesus. And sadly, most of us don't either take it seriously, or we have just kind of made Jesus into who we want. And I think we go back and no, this is a guy that loved enemies, and rather than conquering Rome and winning by force, chose to die and submit and revealed his power that way. Like, okay, let's talk about that kind of a Jesus. And so I do think there's got to be some level of objectivity, but you're never going to remove the subjective experience part, from the whole part of it.
Right. And then you get into questions about the reliability of the Bible. But I think maybe we should move on to the next question.
All right, let's do it.